Hi everybody, welcome to tonight's program, Curator's Choice. Tonight we have our curator, Shoshana Resnikoff, who will be focusing on 3 rival-themed objects in our collection. Before I hand the reins over to Shoshana, I want to take a moment to thank our members for your continued support. We hope that you enjoyed tonight's program and encourage your friends and family members and colleagues to join the Wolfsonian family and become a member as well. The run of show for tonight's program will be a presentation by Shoshana, then we'll open up for a Q&A towards the end of the program. We have disabled the chat, so for the Q&A portion, just use the Q&A chat area towards the bottom right of the screen. So Shoshana, take it away.
Sure, and thank you, Alexandra. I am so excited to be doing this. It was a great reason to put on makeup and jewelry for the first time in probably 4 months. And so I am excited to be sharing these objects with you all, as well as sort of a sneak peek into some of the research I've been doing. You'll note that I've titled this presentation Revivals, and that's because I have been spending much of the last couple of months, when not working on other sort of more urgent museum business, thinking about the role of history in decorative arts. It's a subject that's long been of interest to me, and it's exciting to have the opportunity, even if it's for a really upsetting reason, like a pandemic, to spend some time thinking about this topic. You'll note that there's an asterisk by the word revivals, and that is because I don't just want to talk about strict revival style. There are many styles known as revival, XYZ revival, but we're going to be talking about more than that. We will be looking at revivals, but also history and culture and nostalgia and all of these really related ideas that are complicated for a title, but worthy of the nuance. And so I hope you'll come with me on this journey. One of the downsides, obviously, to the last couple of months is that I haven't had my amazing colleagues to bounce ideas off of and consult for research. Certainly I haven't been in the office with them, but I have had one colleague, Buttercup, who has helped me with this research as much as she could. So she might interrupt this at some point. So if you hear a meow or see a small yellow cat, that's who that is. She does not have a lot of opinions about revival furniture, though, so we're on our own for this. When I talk about revival, what I'm talking about are revival styles, which for our working definition, we can say are works that mine historical design for contemporary objects, for objects made in their own time period, creating either exact reproductions or reinterpretations. And so these are just a couple of examples of what we can think of as revival objects or representative of a revival style. In the upper left corner, you have A.W. Pugin's beautiful Gothic Revival cabinet. There's also the Rococo Revival, which you can see in that settee to the right of the cabinet. That's this American sort of explosion of Rococo decoration that we associate with the 18th century, but manifesting itself in an almost more luxurious way in the middle of the 19th century. The chair below is by Wallace Nutting, the famous photographer and sort of reproduction artist from the 1930s in the United States, who is responsible for so much Colonial Revival furniture that actually much of that stuff made it into museums as originals unintentionally because his reproductions were so good. And then of course our own ceiling from the 6th floor of the gallery that many of you, 6th floor of the museum that many of you will recognize, which is Mediterranean Revival in style. But there are objects that interact with both history and culture that are not necessarily strictly revival. And I want to talk about those sorts of objects as well. I want to connect them on this spectrum of engagement with history. And I mentioned culture as well because history and culture are inextricably linked. So these are examples of objects that reference history and certainly also reference culture, but are not strictly revival, whether that's the 1920s Carl Malmsten chest to the upper left, which is this beautiful Art Deco object that features 18th century Swedish references in that foliage in the center, or the arts and crafts bench or chest below, These are all objects that engage with history and culture. And again, I think those ideas are so connected because different cultures and communities draw from different historical experiences and events, or see the same historical event in different ways. And so to me, history and culture go hand in hand, and you can't really talk about one without talking about the other. So that begs the question, can an object that is not technically revival have historical or cultural influences? And the answer is absolutely yes. In the center, we have a drawing by the British arts and crafts designer, Frank Brangwyn. That design drawing is from the collection at the Wolfsonian. And you can see that he's referencing the 18th century yoke-back chair, Chinese yoke-back chair on the left. And then the final product on the right, kind of showing how that manifests itself. Of course, the chair on the left and the chair on the right we do not have in our collection, but the design drawing in the middle we do. And it's also interesting, of course, that Frank Brangwyn is British, and the history that he's referencing is Chinese, it's 18th century Chinese. And that is also something that I'm interested in exploring. When historical styles reference a designer's own history, a sort of we could call it indigeneity, or sort of a history that speaks to their own nationality, versus when they're borrowing someone else's history, I think those objects have really different intentions. So I've been thinking about revival, and I've been thinking about history and decorative arts. And so I thought I would put together a paragraph that in many ways would function as sort of the opening salvo if I were to pitch this project for an exhibition. I have not really done that. These are very early stages of research, but I thought it could be fun to give you guys some insight into how that works for me. So you can see that I would write a sort of paragraph that said something like, from the late 19th to the middle of the 20th century, revival styles swept Europe and the United States. Intended to remind consumers and users of a storied past, they reveal far more about contemporary concerns and intellectual pursuits. From the seemingly benign, like archaeological discoveries and technological advances, to the politically charged, weaponized nostalgia and nationalism, revival designers alighted of the moment issues with historical aesthetics, creating imaginary pasts to shape the look and feel of the present. Now tonight, we're just going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to talk about Europe. We're going to talk about the intellectual pursuits and the archaeological discoveries that fueled many of these styles. And we're also going to talk a little bit about nationalism. And specifically, we're going to look at three chairs. You can see they're the ones lit up with the green. We're going to start at the bottom with the Lars Kim Sardick chair, go up to the middle with the Orkney chair, and then finish with Paul Foyet's chair in the upper right. And so with that rather long introduction, we'll get into it. All right, like I said, we start with Lars Kim Sardick and this armchair, which is designed circa 1899, circa 1900, the date's a little unsure. Lars Kim Sardick is a Norwegian designer at the end of the 19th century. And he, along with a few other designers, are really responsible for originating a design that's sometimes called the Viking style, and also in Norway is called dragastil. I should also say, as an aside, there's going to be a lot of me butchering a lot of words that are not English tonight, and so I apologize in advance. I am distressingly monolingual, except for 9 years of Hebrew. So, and that's not one of the languages we're going to be reviewing tonight. So I apologize for my accent. Kim Sardick, like many of these designers, was really interested in developing a style that felt unique to Norway and that expressed Norwegian nationalist desires and impulses. Up until this point, Norway has been under the control of Denmark for a while, and then Sweden, and this is all about asserting sort of Norwegian exceptionalism in a way, the singularity of the Norwegian culture and the Norwegian ideal. And so Kim Sardick and many other designers refer to a Viking history and to a medieval history, and they go back to the medieval period to find inspiration for these modern designs. Specifically, they are also fueled by archaeology. There's a boom of Viking archaeology at the end of the 19th century. And you can see here the tuna ship excavated in 1867, but dating to circa 900, which is one of the very first Viking ships that is excavated in Norway and becomes this enormous cultural and historical event. It's now on view in Oslo. If you want to see it, it's pretty cool. And so the design of that ship becomes a major inspiration, and all of the sort of associated archaeological projects. Also, many of these designers and architects, including Kim Sardick, are looking back at 13th century or medieval church architecture as well. So this is called a stave church. This is the Hedal stave church, also in Norway. And you can see the multiple gables, the use almost entirely of wood, the way that the building sort of stacks on itself. I have a friend who describes these as Goth churches, not of course referencing Visigoths, but like angsty middle schoolers. And I do think that, if I were an angsty middle schooler, I would be really into the architecture of this church. And you can even see coming out of the gables, these forms that are actually often dragon heads emerging out. And so we'll see that repeated again and again. It manifests itself architecturally, the Dragastil, in hotels like this, the Dalen Hotel, which is this mix of Swiss chalet architecture and Dragastil, and you can again see those wonderful gables and the dragons coming out of the roof line. Kim Sardick makes multiple versions of this chair. There are 3 that you can just easily Google: our own, the Musée d'Orsay's, and the Viennese. 2 of them were exhibited at the 1900 exposition in Paris, likely the d'Orsay's and the Viennese, and they all share this kind of common treatment: heavily carved dragon's heads coming out of the backs of the chair, geometric and sinuous carving. That's a mark of Dragastil, and then also the use of paint within the carving to illuminate sections. I'm particularly fond of ours, which is on the right, in part because it has a little face in the footrail, which I think makes it special and unique. But one thing that I love about all 3 of them is the way that the back stretcher curves through the sort of stakes of the chair, the legs. You sort of really muscular, the joinery really clear, and we're going to see again and again how important joinery is in these revival furniture styles, and so I think that's important to hold on to. There are other examples of his work that I think frankly are not as good, if I'm being honest, but they're still lovely and wonderful. This 1905 chair from the Higgins Museum and Gallery in Bedford, England, and this, truly bonkers cabinet also at the Musée d'Orsay, potentially also made as part of that suite of furniture for the 1900 exposition in Paris. There are other examples of of Dragastil and Viking Revival within the Wolfsonian collection. You can see that this isn't just Lars Kim Sardick on his weird dragon style kick. This is kind of a massive cultural innovation. This is Daughters of the Northern Lights, based off a set of paintings by Gerhard Munthe, who was a Norwegian sort of national romanticist artist, with the weaving done by Nini Stoltenberg a couple of decades later. And what is interesting is that the story, Daughters of the Northern Lights, is not actually a Norse myth. It's not a folk tale. Munthe has actually kind of created whole cloth a story that seems like it could be a folk tale. And so we can begin to see how revival styles can move from being sort of, historically mined to sort of historically inspired, but very fantastic and even imaginary. And that's certainly what's happened with Daughters of the Northern Lights. It feels like it could be a Norwegian folktale, even though it isn't. Many of these revival styles, like Dragastil, do reference kind of folk history and folk vernacular design in their production, but sometimes they become incredibly high end. And so this is an example of the really refined end. And I should say that all, the Munthe and the Kim Sardick chair would have been very expensive. They just would have been evoking a more rough-hewn style. And here we get the refined end, which is this covered cup by Henrik Möller, not in our collection. If anyone could ever get their hands on it and give it to us, I'd love them forever. But even in this like incredibly refined silversmithing, you can see the same dragons appearing again and again, those same sort of sinuous lines and curves and geometry that we associate with Dragastil. An interesting thing that happens with the revival styles is that they don't always stay in their home countries. And when they leave their home, they become very different. So this is an example of the way that Dragastil, and this interest in Viking revival and Scandinavian history begins in Scandinavia, where it's local, and then makes its way to the United States, where it has nothing to do with the history of the country and everything to do with sort of fantasy, and is really divorced from its history. And so here we can see the Viking ship centerpiece by Gorham Manufacturing, based in Providence, as well as the design drawing from RISD, from the RISD archives, where they have all the Gorham papers. And this is just, you know, has many of the same references, the dragons, the shields, but doesn't have any of the historical meaning or the political implications of a nationalist style outside of its home country. And then maybe my favorite object of all time, certainly one of the most truly, truly unbelievable objects I've ever seen. This dressing table and a chair designed by Tiffany and Company for Maymont Mansion in Richmond, Virginia. If you're ever in Richmond, you have to go. It is really just a feast for the senses. And specifically, this vanity is by Tiffany in a Viking Revival style, made of narwhal tusk and sterling silver. So those are two narwhal tusks supporting the vanity. And the fact that it completely, you miss the swan bed behind it for its insanity, I think tells you everything you need to know about how absurd this home is and amazing. But here again, you know, this is totally divorced from the history of Norway and has everything to do with sort of fantasy and an imaginary past. Although again, you can see on the chair and also above on the top of the vanity, there are the dragon heads rearing their heads again. And so they remain a sort of vestigial reference to this national history. All right, we started kind of folk, we made our way to the high end, and now we are back at vernacular. We are going to leave Norway and we are going to go to Scotland, to the Orkney Islands, and to this armchair designed circa 1900 and retailed at Liberty and Company. You'll notice that I don't have a maker's name on this, and that's because we're not 100% sure, but we do have a theory about who made it, and I'm like pretty positive. It's made of oak and rush, really simple materials that would have been plentiful on the Orkney Islands. So here we are. We've come to Orkney, a windswept region of islands off the coast of Scotland, cold, forbidding, but also really beautiful and fertile, and known for the seagrass and the rush that you can collect on Orkney. The chair itself, the Orkney Chair, is a vernacular form, which means that it sort of emerged organically from the community to serve specific local needs. In this case, the Orkney Chair was often made by crofters or fishermen within their own homes or by a local joiner. It sort of becomes a popular form in Orkney at the beginning of the 19th century. And each chair made in the communities has like a very slightly different feel, different dimensions. There's nothing standardized about it because it's just some guy making one in his own shop, or maybe making a couple for his neighbors. And so they're really idiosyncratic. But at the end of the 19th century, in 1890, George McThomas Toms, who was the sheriff of Orkney, commissions a chair from David Kirkness, seen here in his workshop, and likes it, and is himself a great booster and advocate of Orkney arts and crafts. And he commissions two more from David Kirkness to be sent to the Edinburgh International Exposition in Edinburgh for 1890 to be shown in a Scottish crafts exhibition. And what's important about that exhibition is that oftentimes crafts were shown in expositions as sort of design inspiration for local designers. Like, so the V&A was founded as a design museum out of the Crystal Palace exposition to teach designers how to design things. And so they're meant to be inspiration for other artists. In this case, though, the Scottish crafts exhibition was really commercial. They just wanted to sell objects, and they wanted to support local craftspeople in a struggling Scottish economy. And so this is like a truly commercial, not particularly artistic sort of impulse. But David Kirkness's chairs proved so popular, Liberty, the retailer in London, orders 40 of them, and then continues to place more orders in the years to come. And that's why we are pretty sure that our chair is a David Kirkness chair, because it was retailed at Liberty. And you can see, and we know that ours was purchased there. You can see the catalog where they published the chair in 1901 to the left. And then you can see this hooded version of it One of the things that David Kirkness did as a craftsman for Liberty is that he standardized the form, standard dimensions, and in 4 different versions. So one is this hooded version, which has a drawer. The hood was supposedly to help tired farmers and sailors, fishermen, as they came home, avoid the hubbub of the home and isolate from his children and wives. I think that's kind of like later sort of reading into a chair design that probably has nothing to do with its origins, and frankly a little bit sexist, but whatever. Then a gentleman's chair, a man's chair, which we think ours is, and then a lady's chair and a child's chair, which is tiny and adorable. Interestingly, Tom's, who was the sheriff who advocated for these chairs, felt really strongly that the one with the drawer was a bad chair to retail because it was too vernacular, it was too folk. He wanted these chairs to be purchased by wealthy cosmopolitans who had enough storage. They didn't need a folksy little drawer underneath their chair. So that's just an interesting sort of way in which the vernacular form is shaped or influenced by a more cosmopolitan consumer base. I say that we think ours is Liberty. We know that ours is Liberty, and we think it's David Kirkness. He was known in his Liberty chair, in his chairs they made for Liberty, putting a curl on the end of the arms, as you can see here. So, short of having his signature on it, I feel pretty confident. This is his price list. You can see the 4 chairs, the 4 chair styles with the little children's chair on top of the lady's chair, and how much he would have retailed them for. It is also important to note that these chairs, though they were made in Orkney and sold, many of them sold throughout the UK, they actually went around the globe. They end up in India, in South Africa, in the United States, in Asia, and so they really do become this Scottish export. They also, like I said, become popular with wealthy people. King Edward had 2 of them. This is the dining room at Windy Hill, which is a house designed by Charles Rennie Mackintosh. And you can see that there's a Orkney chair to the left of the fireplace with a Mackintosh chair sort of matching it to the right. I don't know if the owner of the home already had the chair and wanted it incorporated, or if Mackintosh himself was fond of it. So it's hard to know, but for whatever reason, it ended up in a Mackintosh home. And it even, as a design form, makes it to the Netherlands. These are chairs designed by Chris Vegeriff, again, slaughtered that last name, that are looking at the Orkney form, but are made out of teak, reflecting the Netherlands' history of trade and the East India, its East India history. And so you can see the way that they take that these designers in the Netherlands take this form and sort of alter it, especially in the chair to the right, but still staying very true to the kind of simple vernacular history. These chairs continue to be produced. This is one made in 1971 by Reynold Junsen, who takes over David Kirkness's shop when he dies. And here he's used Japanese oak, a reflection of global trade, but also a desire on the part of some of his higher-end clients for a more expensive material, a more luxurious wood. Also in the Viennese collection. And then actually, as recently as this past September, there was a New York Times article praising the Orkney chair as this example of local crafts produced in the Scottish Islands. And so on the 3 on the left are various versions of sort of modernist Orkney chairs, contemporary Orkney chairs designed by Scottish designers today and sold in London. And then of course on the right is the classic Orkney chair. Okay. We've done Norway, we've done a remote Scottish island, and now we're going to France. But we're not going to Paris. Instead, we are traveling to the northwest of France, to Brittany, to talk about one of the chairs that I find, it's one of my favorites that is currently on view. If we could be in the gallery right now, I would take us up to the 5th floor, to the first entry gallery, and make you all look at this chair because I love it so much. Paul Foyet designed it in the 1930s, and it is a really great example of kind of Breton folk design. Brittany is, like I said, in the northwest of France. And it is culturally really different and historically really different from the rest of France. It sort of has a Celtic history. It shares a lot of commonalities with Britain, even down to its name, obviously. And the region has, for centuries, had a real cultural separatist vibe to it, and also politically has advocated for separation at various points. And so there's this real rich history of cultural, of isolation and kind of looking inward on their culture and not engaging with kind of the hegemony of France, if you will. And so in the beginning of the 20th century, an artistic movement emerges called the Sesber. And the Sesber is a movement led first by Jean Malaval, who was responsible for these beautiful woodcuts, and then also by Renée Yves Creston, who we'll see later. But Malaval, I want to point out in particular with her woodcuts, she illustrated histories of Brittany. And one of my favorite images is on the left. It's called the Union of Brittany and France. Brittany is the woman with her head in her hand, and France is represented by the woman in the fleur-de-lis cloak. And you see she's comforting Brittany with one hand and reaching into her bag with the other, stealing from Brittany. And so that it sort of perfectly encapsulates the Breton perspective on their relationship to France. Jean Malaval dies quite young, but Renée Yves Creston and his wife Suzanne, as well as other artists, sort of pick up the mantle and form the Sesber as this artistic movement to resist sort of the art of France and assert the importance of Breton art and history and culture. And they publish a manifesto calling all Breton artists to recreate Breton art. That's the word they use. And so it really is, though it's not technically a revival style, it is really imbued with the ideas of revivalism. This globe, designed by Creston, also currently in our collection, really perfectly captures this pride. It represents the accomplishments of Breton sailors through history, all the places they've gone, and what it says around the band is, wherever the sun is, there is a Breton man. The idea being that the maritime accomplishments of Breton are worthy of celebration. This was exhibited at the 1931 Colonial Exposition. So Paul Foyet, we come back to this chair. He was actually not a member of the Sesber officially, but he was absolutely a believer in their mission and engaged with their ideology. And so you can see the ways that he's done that. Again, I said, look at joinery. There is a heaviness to it. It is, again, this kind of folksiness intentionally, the way that those stretchers kind of look to break through the sides with those enormous mortise and tenon joints. That is such a rejection of the polished manufacturing techniques of the modern designer. But then, of course, there is the use of sunflowers throughout the chair, which is an important symbol in Breton art, and the geometry of it. It's really symmetrical. That sawtooth zigzag pattern appears throughout Sesber art and Breton art, and really just the sort of stolid heaviness of it makes a statement. But my favorite part of it is probably the back of the seat of the chair, where Foyet has so beautifully inlaid these peasant figures. The folk costume of Breton is significant at festivals and at events. People dress up in this historic costume, and it's regionally specific, and that's a really important expression of culture. And so he captures that energy and that sort of look in the chair. What I love too about these folk costumes is that they remind me of maybe my favorite painting at the Art Institute of Chicago, which is, I feel like it's a deep cut. Everyone loves Nighthawks, everyone loves the Monets, but Gaston Latouche's Pardon in Brittany is an underappreciated painting. And Latouche was a Parisian artist who traveled to Brittany and painted this pilgrimage scene. And what I love so much about it is that he's painted in an impressionist style, which was radical at the time, and plein air, modern, contemporary. And yet what he's captured is this deeply historical anti-modern moment. Brittany is very religious. and the pilgrimages were incredibly important. And it is really a countercultural, aggressive staking of a claim of the importance of history and the rejection of modernity, painted in this very modern style. And so I just love it. The end of the Sesber is a sad one. Like much of Europe, they are destroyed by the Nazis. They are split up by the Nazis. Specifically, what happens is that with the rise of Nazism in Germany, some members of the Sesber, of this artistic movement, joined the Breton National Party, which was a separatist party that allied itself with the Nazis in the hopes that once they took power, the Nazis would make Britain an independent nation from France, make Brittany an independent nation from France. Some of them were also what we would consider today to be white supremacists. They believed that as Celts, the Bretons were racially superior to other people and were Aryan. And so this was also an opportunity to exercise that set of feelings. But many of the members of the Sesber rejected that ideology and were in fact resistance fighters. In fact, Creston, who was the leader of the Sesber, becomes one of the most important resistance fighters in France, and even leads a number of, or transmits some really important information to the British that leads to a number of important raids. And so he is himself this sort of great hero of the region and of the period. So I don't want to end with Nazis, because I feel like I often do that in my presentations. So instead, I want to end with this object. This was not one of the ones of my 3 curator's choice, but I've taken you on this journey through those objects to other works. And this is in the Wolfsonian collection. This is a relatively recent purchase by Mickey and donated to the collection. This buffet is designed in collaboration between Joseph Savina and the famous modernist architect designer Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier vacationed in Brittany often, and in 1935 meets Savina. Savina is a woodworker who is a member of the Sesber. And they strike up a friendship and a correspondence, and work on a number of objects together, and particularly this buffet, which is completed around 1937. And in it, Savina has captured those wavy vertical lines represent the vertical cliffs of Brittany, off the coast of Brittany, right by his studio. So they are this abstract capture of the region and of his home. And what I love about it is that we tend to think of revival styles and styles that engage with history or regional culture as being anti-modern, and in many cases they can be. But there are places where the modern and the historical meet. And Kim Sardick's chair is an example of that. He's trying to bring this history into the present. The Orkney Chair is perhaps less so, although the most recent sort of contemporary innovations on it certainly do. But I think this buffet really captures that marriage of the modern and the historical, and the way that objects can honor history and can look backwards while also doing important work, pushing design forward. So with that, I'm going to take a drink of water and turn it over to Alex.
Thank you, Shoshana. I truly enjoyed that tour of Europe and all of the details on, the objects and all of the chairs, and especially ending it with this, kind of merging, like you said, kind of the revival history of the past, but still making it like modern. So I love that. So we're going to open it up. If anyone has a question, please feel free to ask your question with the Q&A button below. And now's your time to pick Shoshana's brain.
It doesn't just have to be about objects. It could be about Buttercup or, research.
Yeah, Shoshana has a new cat named Buttercup, so we can open it up to that as well. So we have one question. So Michael wants to know if we've ever taken apart the Brittany chair.
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know is the short answer. I would have to, sadly, I don't currently have access to our hard copy files. And so I can't check that, but I would love to. If we had, it would be documented in that file, and we could see. If not, I'd love to get permission to one day. What's interesting too is that the Carnegie Museum of Art, this was a suite of furniture. He produced a number, we have 2 of these chairs, and then there's a settee at the Carnegie Museum of Art, and I would be interesting to get in touch with them to find out if they had ever taken it apart or had any documentation. So I don't know, but maybe one day.
All right. So like Shoshana, I'm probably going to butcher some of these names, so I apologize. One question is, would you consider the Finjul Kypton chair, again, I apologize, as a continuation of the Viking style?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that's an argument that could be made. Certainly referencing a history, but I would say like more modern, and kind of pushing it forward. So yeah, I think one of the things that's fun and also potentially frustrating about this is that you can read a lot of history into objects, because it is like no matter the sort of resolutely modern intention of the designer, objects are rarely made in a vacuum. And I tend to read history into objects because I see that interconnectivity. But yeah, I think that is I think that's a fair assessment.
Kevin wants to know what is inside the buffet and what type of wood, if you know.
The buffet is oak. I'm sure I've seen it open. I cannot remember what the inside looks like. I'm sorry, Kevin. That's a great question. Now I want to know. I'm guessing shelves, probably split down the middle and like bigger shelves on one side and more shelves on the other, but truly just a guess based on looking at a lot of buffets in my life.
Could you address what we might call the Confederacy Revival? You mentioned the Colonial Revival, which came fast on its heels.
Yes, I can address that with some caution and also some pleasure. Pleasure at dismantling it, not in favor of it, to be clear. Yeah, so the Colonial Revival is this desire and this sort of impulse in art and architecture and design, really beginning actually in the 1890s, but coming into its fullest fruition in the 1930s, in the 20s and 30s in the United States, to assert a sort of true American style, and to go back to the colonial period for inspiration. What's interesting is that like different designers say that different things are true American styles. There are designers who say that Native American aesthetics are the true American style. So like there's not agreement on this, but there are certainly a group of architects and designers and artists who believe very strongly that this is that the colonial look and feel is the American look and feel. What is interesting is that they are not usually kind of avant-garde designers and architects. These are much more conservative, and they are often also sort of in line with, whether intentionally or sort of it's just in the ether, a sort of political sense that America needs to be American. And of course, it is all in line with increased immigration and the unrest coming out of Europe, and refugees. All of that is sort of consciously and unconsciously stewing beneath the surface for a lot of these things. And so you see the rise of sort of the Georgian columned homes, the four square homes with where you enter and then there's a room and a room and then a room and a room on top. The house, I mean, that you would think of the City Beautiful movement almost as an early manifestation of the Colonial Revival. And then what happens is around the same time, or a little bit later than the 30s, is you get the rise of the lost cause in the South, which is this mythology around the idea of the sort of nobility of the Confederacy, which is a movement that's really fueled by the Daughters of the Confederacy, which, you know, they would say coincidentally, I think we would say much more deliberately, happens alongside early civil rights movements and into the 1950s and 60s as civil rights movements pick up steam and gain strength. This sort of reactionary rise of the lost cause takes hold, and that results in also, again, reifying these early American architectural and artistic principles alongside the monumentizing of the Confederacy in the form of these monuments that we're seeing come down. I don't know if that like pulls those two things together enough. One could write multiple books about this, and I'm certainly not the expert on that, but that's certainly how I see those two things related to each other in ways that are incredibly powerful and also really insidious and sometimes hard to track.
So we have another question. If you could scan back to the 3 chairs, I think they just wanted to take
the very beginning,
another look at them.
The 3, which 3 chairs?
I think it was the 3 of the same, and how we have one in our collection.
Oh yeah, the Kim Sardics. Sure. And our chair should say circa 1899. I don't know enough about why we have that date specifically, but we have a circa 1899 date, and the Musée d'Orsay and the V&A have a circa 1900 date.
We also had another question. How do you spell Sesber?
Oh, great question. I've misspelled it many times in my life. S-E-I-Z, and then Bur is actually Brur, B-R-U-E-R.
Okay, great.
And it means 7 brothers, which is, there are not 7 members of the Sesber, but it is a folktale. The Breton, it's a Breton folktale.
Great. I'm just going through the questions. If anyone has any questions that they want to ask before we end the program tonight. I did have a question that someone does want to see your Buttercup.
Oh,
if she can make an appearance. If she's busy, that's okay.
Yeah. Oh, she's sleeping. I'm sorry.
Next program, it's fine.
Yeah. Here. There she is.
Beautiful. So again, I just want to thank Shoshana for taking the time out tonight to, kind of spend some time with us, go through some of the objects in the collection, go through these chairs. I've learned a lot tonight, so I truly appreciate it. I'm sure our members do as well. I want to thank our members for joining us tonight, and, check out our website for up-to-date programs and events, and make sure that you are also subscribed to our newsletter. And that's it for tonight. I guess we will see you for next month's Curator Choice. Have a good night.
Thank you all so much.